Welcome back. Or if this is your first video, then of course, welcome to YouTube. I've had some requests for specific tutorials on things like textures. So today we are going to start our very first video on tree bark textures for beginners. And I will put all of these tutorials about textures in a specific playlist so that they are easy to find. But then I will keep making other videos as well on loose watercolors and things like that too. So just stay tuned, there's lots more coming your way. Now for textures, there's lots of different ways to do tree bark. I'm going to show you today the texture method that works best for me. I get the best results from it. Just know that there are different ways to do it. But today we are talking about the ones that I have found the most useful, that give the best results. The first tree we're going to do is a white birch. So I'm going to use a mixture of buff titanium and zinc white. Zinc white is more of a transparent white. Permanent white or titanium white is more opaque. And for this, I want the transparency because I want this to show through to some extent. So I'm going to take that and I'm just going to drag down a trunk. We're not going to do whole trees today since we're talking about tree textures, so we'll just have a bunch of trunks. And I want it to stay wet for a few minutes, so you can be generous with it. And it's kind of a thick birch. That's okay. All right. And now I am going to take a mixture. You know, birches can have different tones. They can have a gray tone, they can have a brown tone. So I have mixed up kind of an ugly color that's it's burnt umber and sepia and just a hint of, it's a green. I'll think of it in a second. Okay, so I just want to make a few marks with that kind of brownish, blackish, and we want it to bleed out that way because that's how those trees do. That's probably enough. So we're going to let that dry for just a second. Okay, that's dry now. So this was greenish umber, burnt umber, and sepia mixed to get that darker tone. So you could just leave this just as it is, or I'm going to add a little shadow to all of my trees today. So I'm going to just put a little bit of burnt umber in this mixture. And put it down the side here for a shadow, and then I'm going to soften it up. Starting out here and working my way to it. I've just dried my brush on a little towel and I'm just feathering that color out a little bit to soften it. And you could work on this more if you wanted. It depends on how realistic you want it. All the trees today, the only thing you need to do to make something more realistic is just keep adding layers to it. All right. So that's the birch. Now I like to do a twisted trunk quite a lot. So for a twisted trunk, it's going to be wider at the bottom. So I typically just kind of start out down here and lay out my trunk. And now I want to start working with a little bit darker and a little bit darker. I'll just make some little strokes like that, and we're going to start twisting it up with the darker colors. So this video is getting very lengthy, and I really don't want to have it just go on and on while I'm painting, so let me just cut in here real quick and I'll explain, you know, what I'm doing while we watch it in fast motion. So I'm keeping this tree trunk very wet, not very wet, but wet, and just gradually adding darker and darker tones in that spiraling layout so that it's still wet, so it's bleeding into the surrounding area just a little bit, and that keeps the texture very soft and fuzzy like a lot of trees tend to be. And I'm taking several browns on all my trees. I'm going to use just several browns, and you can use whatever browns you want. That's what makes them look so nice and have a hint of realism, is the variegated colors. And then you just keep layering more and more with a little bit darker and a little bit darker, a little more detail. You start refining those little cracks and crevices, making those deeper and deeper, and that brings the texture out so much. We're going to do the same technique for every tree. You can stop any tree at any point depending on how detailed you want it. So the next one, so I'm just going to drag down a basic trunk, and this is Van Dyke brown. It's one of my favorite browns. All right, we got us a nice thick tree there. And let's just do a little limb off to the side. We can let more pigment build up here, because that's usually the way it is. And let's just start darkening this up. I'll do the same thing where I want this side of the tree to be darker. And so I like to not drag it all the way down. That's not very natural. So just have some, and we're going to add more of this as we go along. But let's just start getting some of this texture built up. You see this dried very fast. So while that's all still wet, I'm going to use my old trick of using the paint tube while it's still wet, and I'll add some little squiggly bark lines. This is my favorite texture method. See, that's all dry, so we'll have to come back when we re-wet it in a minute. Now on the rest of our trees, we are going to work layer by layer, allowing it to dry between layers. So I've let that dry. Now I'm coming back with clean water here, and then I will drop in a little bit darker color. I don't want to add it all over. Let's just make it spotty. That's more realistic. So I'm dropping in this umber here in various spots, and then I will come back with this darker. I'm using the sepia mixture that we had before. This makes a really good, pretty shadow, and it has a little bit of the green in it that you often see, that tone in trees. Then I will let it dry again, add a little water. Again, we're just blending out spots of color, and I'm adding that dark sepia mixture in the crevices that we've made. That's what makes the trees pop off the page, are the darker tones against the light and medium tones. And those dark crevices really make it almost a 3D effect the more you work with it and the deeper you get those crevices. Now on the twisted tree, we did not allow it to dry between layers, just because I wanted that nice soft wood texture. But on these other trees, for one thing, they're so large. When we're dealing with a large tree like this, you really want to take that into consideration, and it's easier to work with if you let it dry between the layers. But now let's move on to the next tree, which will be a darker tree. This is burnt umber that we're going to start with. And again, I'll do a limb going out here, just because we've done it before. If you want, you can also use one of these sea sponges, especially on that first layer, to give some underneath texture. Just be careful if you're doing a real painting, you know, don't let it overstep your tree. So as it's drying, I'm just dabbing it to add that texture. And you can do this on any layer, really. I'm just adding it on the first layer because that's going to be peeking through, and then we might come back later and add it again. We'll see. And so from here, we just continue on as we did before, adding the darker tones, especially more towards the left, so that we can mimic that shadow, and that makes it kind of pop off the page a little better. Then I just want to make sure that we continue not to do straight lines all the way from the top to the bottom. You want to jagged it up a little bit, just like normal bark is. And on this one, I'm going to use my paint tube again. I've used the sponge again. You know, you just keep working with it over and over and over. And that's what really makes it pop off the page. On this one, I'm adding a little squirrel hole just for the fun of it. You can add a bunch of different colors. That helps in the realism as well. There are so many techniques for making textures. You could use some cellophane, crumpled up aluminum foil, but for me, this is the best results. Is just using this paint tube to get the scratches and the various colors. And the sponge can help too a little bit. But so you can just play with it and do it the way that works best for you. Okay, there are 4 examples. Now, certainly we could have added that gray-green patches. Sometimes it's yellow patches that are lichens. We could have done that. We could have added some other type funguses, but without this going on and on for an hour-long tutorial, I just wanted to give you these basic beginning steps of how to form tree bark. Maybe we could do another tutorial on those other things at some point. But I hope this gets you started in the right direction. If you found this tutorial useful, please give me a thumbs up and let me know. And please subscribe if you haven't already for more tutorials coming up. Thanks so much.